So welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good lunch break. So this is the session on systems. I don't know why there are quotes in the program, but I was told I should present this as systems. And the first talk is by Ruben on Tithonus Bitcoin-based censorship resilience. Ruben, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the audience for your attendance. This research is a joint effort with my advisor, Bogdan Karbunar, from the Casper Lab at Florida International University. So the motivation for our research is that state-level censorship as performed by countries is on the rise. We have countries such as Russia and China that are increasingly ramping up their efforts in order to control and disrupt access to outside services. The problem is that censorship as performed by a state-level adversaries are very powerful. Not only can they block traffic and corrupt it, but more importantly, they can observe and monitor all communications going in and out of the censored area. As you can imagine, this is very problematic for a user of a censorship-resistant system, or a CRS, that does not provide enough protection for this sort of persistent monitoring. Explicitly, your adversary doesn't even need to block or corrupt your traffic if they can simply detect that you're using a CRS and then cannot pay an unfriendly visit to your house, right? And so unfortunately, even though this vulnerability is very evident, it is actually present in many tools such as VPNs and even vanilla Tor. Now, what we would like to do as a consequence is to create a system that it is not only difficult to block, but it is also difficult to detect and monitor in this way. And in order to do that, we leverage the observation that communication requirements are somewhat asymmetric. In-to-out communication is, of course, lower throughput, but more importantly, it needs to be uncensorable and undetectable, as we just discussed. In contrast, however, out-to-in communication is, of course, higher throughput, but it only needs to be uncensorable as long as the user is able to access this information undetectably, as we required in the in-to-out communication mode. So leveraging this asymmetry in the requirements, we introduced Titanus, a censorship-resistant system. Titanus builds on the idea that cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin are difficult to block without also impacting their financial functionality. Explicitly, Titanus tries to use collateral damage in order to embed otherwise uncensorable communications into Bitcoin transactions. As a consequence, we assume that the censor is unwilling to disrupt this financial functionality of the underlying cryptocurrency system. So with this description, the system model should be very evident, right? So we have a user that is inside the censored area, and he issues requests that it embeds into Bitcoin transactions that are received by the Titanus server that, of course, lives outside the censored area. This server, in turn, forwards the request to the intended destination and then embeds back the response into other Bitcoin transactions that eventually made its way to the original user. Now, this sounds very easy, but of course it has many challenges, and I've chosen 3 of those challenges to discuss in this presentation. However, we have many other challenges that are described in our paper. The first challenge that I would like to talk about is the amount of data and the associated cost that we can embed into a Bitcoin transaction. Now, previous research includes Catena and Blockstack, and these systems use the fact that we can actually embed data into the output segment of a transaction. As a consequence, there is a very strong limitation of the amount of data that we can embed. For Catena and Blockstack, they can embed up to 80 bytes per transaction output. And for other systems, this quantity is even less. When you compare this quantity to around 200 bytes, which is the normal sort of size of a Bitcoin transaction, it returns a very low writing efficiency. In addition to this, because of the way they chain together these transactions that corresponds to the same data stream, they also need to pay a high transaction fee rate. In the case of Catena, this is up to 70 satoshis per byte. So Titanus, our solution, proposes the use of these staged transactions. And the idea here is that we do not need to overload outputs, but instead we can overload inputs. But in order to do this, we now require 2 transactions instead of just 1, where one of the transactions only stages the spending of the second transaction that actually contains the data. It turns out that using this technique, we can embed up to 1,650 bytes per transaction input, which is a very important improvement. Now, in addition, because of the way we chain these transactions, it turns out that we can also use a very low transaction fee rate, which is close to the minimum, 1 Satoshi per byte. And this is also a very important improvement. Now, the problem with this technique is that it is very detectable, not only because of the size, which is 1,650 bytes normally, but also because of the constructs, the smart contract constructs involved, which are not traditional, are not found traditionally in normally occurring Bitcoin transactions. Therefore, this type of transaction is, we can use it for out-to-in communication. However, for in-to-out communication, we need to find an alternative. And in order to do that, we arrive at the detectability challenge. What we propose is the use of multi-signature constructs, and specifically, we propose the use of a P2SH n out of n multi-signature transactions. These are transactions that require the presence of n valid signatures out of n possible public keys. And so the idea here is to use these m minus n unused public keys to embed the data. Because normally these public keys are never used, the sensor, this is not suspicious to the sensor, and more importantly, these two constructs are completely indistinguishable. Now, we are left with another problem now, which is to embed arbitrary data undetectably into public keys. And in order to do that, we propose the following algorithm. So what we see here is the hex representation of the prime used in the Bitcoin elliptic curve. And the algorithm is as follows. First, we select a chunk of data that is smaller than 2 to the 224 minus 1. This is the value that you see enclosed here on green. Next, we choose a random value that is smaller than the other value enclosed in red on the right. And we concatenate it. The result is, of course, a number that is smaller than p. And so it's inside our field, our group field. Next, we raise this value to the power of 3, subtract 7, and we check whether it's a quadratic residue modulo p. If it isn't, we go back to step 2, choose another random value, and check again. It turns out that we only expect to do this at most twice because of the properties of the elliptic curve used in Bitcoin. Once we do that, it turns out that x is now a valid x coordinate for the public key, and we have actually achieved the embedding of around 28 bytes of arbitrary data. Now, the final challenge that I would like to talk about is about throughput. And the problem here is that previous data insertion techniques have leveraged this on-chain communication, which is very slow. It turns out that in order to confirm a block, we usually require around 10 minutes. And using a policy of 6 confirmations per transaction, it turns out that we have at most a throughput of 1 megabyte per hour. And this is, of course, very small, and this is not even considering the amount of overhead that we need. So the critical observation here is that we can actually use the gossip network in order to transmit our transactions. The gossip network of Bitcoin is the network that is responsible to distribute new transactions before they are mined. It turns out that the gossip network is able to relay all transactions across the whole network in around 3 seconds. And we're going to see that how that works out in practice next. Of course, what we end up doing is that we only use the blockchain for persistence. So in order to evaluate our system, we first set up an injection Bitcoin node that connected to 8 randomly chosen peers. And this is the default behavior for a Bitcoin reference client. We used Titanus to create 9 transactions that embedded the Titanus logo, which was a 14 kilobyte file. In addition, we also set up a Sentinel node that initially contacted 900 nodes on the 12 countries with least freedom of expression according to Reporters Without Borders. Now, from these 900 nodes, only 530 nodes were able to maintain the connections during our experiment. Next, we simply injected our transactions into the network from the injection point, and then we recorded the relay time or as seen by our Sentinel node, from the nodes in the censored countries. The critical observation here is, of course, that this relay time is an upper bound of the time required for our transactions to reach its intended destination. What we see here is our results. We have in the x-axis each of the 9 transactions that we created. And on the y-axis, we have the relay time. So the first observation here is that all nodes, all responding nodes, relayed our Titanus transactions in under 40 seconds. And of course, most of the relay times were more around 3 seconds. For comparison, we have the on-chain persistence taking around 1.8 hours. And if you remember, we talked about 10 minutes per confirmation for each block. And so the natural question to ask here is, why is it taking 1.8 hours to persist on the blockchain? And the reason is because of the transaction fee that we paid. Remember that we said that we were going to pay 1 Satoshi per byte. And so the next question is whether this transaction fee rate also has an impact on the on the use of the Gossip network to transport our transactions. And this is what we did next. We actually repeated our experiment with several different levels of transaction fee rate, and we again calculated the relay time. As you can see here, the distribution is nearly identical, but moreover, even at the lowest fee, our client receives the Titanus transactions in under 5 seconds with a high probability. Now, so the next question is whether there are sufficient nodes that are sufficiently fast in order for our transactions to reach its intended recipient. As you can see here, we have plotted the number of nodes that relayed our transactions in less than 5 seconds. And even for countries with traditional censorship, we see that there is a large number of nodes that are able to relay our transactions very fast. In the case of China, for instance, 41.8% of the nodes relay our transactions in less than 5 seconds. And for the case of Russia, this was 45% of nodes. In fact, the relay time is actually more sensitive to the connectivity infrastructure. And we can see this by plotting the relay time versus the country, the hosting country. And as you can see, each country has a very distinctive pattern of relay time distribution. We also ask the question whether Titanus would be resilient to adversarial nodes. These are nodes that would connect to the network but were not compliant to the Bitcoin protocol. So in another experiment, we contacted 1,526 nodes that also listen on the Bitcoin Gossip port. And it turns out that Titanus still works as well as Bitcoin does. And most importantly, some of these networks are also Titanus compatible. So that means that even if these were at some point replace the Bitcoin network, we could also embed our transactions there. So that pretty much summarizes our results in terms of relay time. And I have here a summary on Titanus costs. So for sending the 14 kilobyte file, it turns out that this has a cost of around 90 cents. And of course, these are prices of 2017 Bitcoin, which are probably a little bit different now. For in-to-out communications, we didn't talk about this, but it turns out that there are different types of setups that we need to do. But even for these types of communications, we also have a very low cost. But most importantly, we are able, as we just saw, that we can pay the lowest possible fee rate and still have an appropriate relay time. Finally, the cost for the average user that reads a 12,000 words article is only around 47 cents. We further compare our results with other censorship resilient systems. For instance, with Catena, the one that we've already mentioned, we already saw that the efficiency was only 0.28. Whereas for Titanus was as much as 0.93. What is very dramatic is that the cost for Catena sending the same 14 kilobyte file was actually around $207, whereas for Titanus was only 90 cents. Also, we also have a very important improvement on the transmission time, because recall that Catena uses this output technique of writing into the blockchain, and also uses the on-chain method of transportation. We also compared Titanus with Collage, which is another CRS that embeds arbitrary data into photos, arbitrary pictures. For Collage, in order to insert the 23 kilobyte file into pictures, it needed around 1 megabyte of worth of pictures. And so this gives a 0.023 writing efficiency, which is not really very important for Collage, because Collage is actually nearly free. However, which is important is that the transmission time is actually very, very different. We are talking about 1 minute versus a few seconds for Titanus. But most importantly, Collage also depends on a centralized third party that hosts these files. Whereas in the case for Titanus, we use this distributed network. We further compared Titanus with Tor. And for this, we had to set up a more elaborate experiment where we had a virtual machine that tunneled all traffic via a paid VPN service from our lab in the US into the Shanghai province. We then used Tor to download the same 14 kilobyte file. And the important result here is that, for instance, for Tor, we were able to download this file in around 10 to 15 seconds, but for Titanus, this was a much, much faster result. Finally, we also compared Titanus with commercial VPNs. And the important point here is that for detectable systems, the cost per unit data of service is actually a division by 0. So we end up with all these infinities here. And also because we never get a response, the download times are also infinity. So in conclusion, I have presented Titanus as a censorship-resistant system that utilizes collateral damage for censorship, for anti-censorship, and it uses mimicry for detectability. I have also shown low-cost and detectable Bitcoin data insertion techniques that reduce the cost of censor clients by 2 orders of magnitude and increase the goodput by 3 to 5 orders of magnitude. And we have also talked a little bit about the trade-off between a higher throughput communication, which is the gossip network, and censorship resilience, which is the on-chain communication. And with that, I will now take your questions.
You need to speak up, that's just for the recording.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I have a question. You said you are paying some fees for the transactions and it doesn't affect for the gossip network, right? So why don't you just pay nothing? Because I think the gossip network will eventually propagate your transaction to the target mempool.
Yes, very good question. So we also, it's a little bit more complicated than just not paying nothing, but we also try to make this system completely free. And the problem that we end up always encountering was that whenever you did this system for free, then your censor can also abuse this system and try to collapse it. So you can imagine at some point that your censor would start flooding your system with fake requests, and eventually your system will not be able to attend true, honest users that would like to also use the system. So that's why we designed Titanus, to impose a low level of cost for the user, but still make it very difficult for the adversary to actually scale its attack and still be appropriately costly. Right? So yeah.
So related to that, right? So I got the impression that the transaction fees are relatively low.
Right.
Right? And in the beginning you were talking about that you want your transactions that go from inside to outside not to be detectable, right? But then if I were sort of putting on my evil hat, then that's the first thing I would try, right? To see if there are many of these transactions with a low fee because they're suspicious.
Okay. Yeah, so the thing is that we used only low fees for the out to in, right? For the in to out, very good. You also need to take into account that. And in fact, it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? We also need to choose what sort of M out of N transactions you need to use, right? And we purposely didn't want to give you like specific numbers because, well, we did this in 2017, and I'm pretty sure this has changed completely now, right? So the ideal case is where this system actually tries to adapt and tries to choose the appropriate parameters according to whatever is on the network at the moment. And the good thing is that we have all that available because the Bitcoin network is completely transparent. So we have all those parameters and statistics available.
Hi, thanks for your talk. So my question's more like high level in terms of using Bitcoin or blockchains as a censorship resistance medium, basically. So, I mean, we do see countries which make interacting with the Bitcoin or any kind of blockchain illegal, like it's a financial crime, and you shouldn't do it. And even though there are nodes running in countries that do censorship, it doesn't mean people in those countries can participate in those networks. So when you say something like it's uncensorable, that makes my alarm bells go off and say, is it really?
Yes. Yeah, very good question too. So yeah, our adversarial model of course assumes that our sensor is unwilling to disrupt the Bitcoin network unless it also wants to deal with the financial effects that this will create. But and this is of course the case, for instance, in countries that have invested quite a lot of money, for instance, in Bitcoin mining, right? If you're a country that has invested quite a lot of money on miners, then whatever you do to disrupt the network is going to be costly to you, right?
I don't know, like, say for example, like China definitely has invested, well, the Chinese government hasn't, but you know, people have.
Right.
And China's interested in making their own financial blockchain-backed system where they want their civilians to use. So I don't think they care about those miners, really. And that's not some sort of economic disincentive to not block it, right?
Yes, I would tend to agree. However, the fact is that even though they would like to block it, so far they haven't, right? Even though they've talked a lot about not liking blockchain, this is still, I guess they are still invested in it. Of course, once they recover their investment, something else may happen, but so far this is not the case, right? Because so far we haven't seen so far we haven't seen any sort of blockage or disruption for the Bitcoin network, as we have seen, for instance, in Tor, right? So China has taken action against Tor specifically, right? However, it hasn't taken any action against Bitcoin yet, right?
Hi, nice talk.
Thank you.
Well, in Iran, censorship usually goes to sites, social medias, and things like that. And there, you need to receive megabytes of information at least. So, what is the use case that you are considering for this system?
You mean specifically for Iran, or
other sensors? Because most of the time, people are like trying to access free internet, a news site, social medias. What use case do you consider that only use like 10 kilobyte of information or something is small that
I see.
is cost effective here?
Yeah, so we were thinking of a user that sort of normally browses the web, right? For instance, they want to access BBC News, or they want to access Twitter, right? And so we actually created a system that downloaded BBC News articles, it defanged them, and of course removed all the pictures, and it only sent the articles, right? And that's the result that we had before, right? The 12,000 word article, it had a cost of, I don't remember, like 47 cents. So I guess you could read quite a lot of articles there, right? So yeah, so our use case is still for this, is still, let's call it moderate size data. Of course, we're not in the level of hundreds of megabytes yet. Not here, not in this, not for this, right? So
one more question.
My understanding is that all the requests will be forever preserved in the blockchain, and a totalitarian regime would love to have that info. Could you please walk us through how you ensure perfect forward secrecy, how the keys are generated to make people safe?
Yes, unfortunately, I don't have a slide for that, but we explore that in the paper. So yeah, maybe I actually have a slide that talks about. So we actually created a whole Titanus communication stack. And so I've only talked about this unit layer and the transport layer, but we also have this chaining layer, and what you're talking about is the security layer. And this is where all the key exchange happens and the end-to-end encryption happens and all that. So we don't even, we always try to preserve the privacy of the user and all that. So yeah, so the details are in the article, but essentially is what you can probably imagine, right? So we set up a security layer, and we also set up a content fetch layer that handles all the details for that. Yeah.
All right, so let's thank Ruben again.
Thank you.
All right, so our next speaker is Elena, and she will present Top Pool. So Elena, please take